The church bell rang low and steady, its sound carrying down Main Street like a warning. I stood on the porch rail of my small ranch house, fingers tightening on the wood, as I stared across the dust toward that white-steepled building. In 3 hours, they'd expect me to walk through its doors in a torn black dress and marry the man who'd taken my husband's life. The same man who had stood by Thomas's grave only 2 weeks before. A dry wind caught at my skirt, and I held tight to the one photograph I had left of him, the paper soft at the edges from years of touch. Far-off boot heels clicked in measured steps, drawing closer. But I kept my eyes on that church, knowing what waited there. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to face a moment where one decision could change the rest of your life. I was born Maggie Holt, the youngest of 5, on a patch of land my father had carved from the prairie with his own hands. We lived hard but fair, measuring our worth not by the coins in our pockets, but by the neighbors we'd stand beside in a hard season. Sunday meant church if the weather allowed, and no one sat down to supper without saying grace. The winters taught us thrift, the summers taught us labor, and both taught us to be content with what we had. A woman's work on the frontier was never done, but I never feared the hours, only the kind of men who tried to buy what should never be sold. When I married Thomas Coleman at 24, I believed we'd spend our years building the kind of home my parents had, steady and modest. Our ranch sat a few miles outside the county seat, close enough for supplies, but far enough to keep the noise of town from touching us. We raised a few head of cattle, tended a kitchen garden, and kept the books balanced with careful hands. Still, the railroad was pushing westward, and with it came speculators, men who measured land not by the lives it sustained, but by the dollars it could bring. The gap between our world and theirs grew wider with every train whistle that cut through the evening air. Clyde Baxter was one of those men. He owned the saloon, the mercantile, and enough property deeds to control the very streets they sat on. Folks called him successful. I called him dangerous. Thomas had turned him down twice when he came sniffing around our ranch with offers that sounded more like threats. The third time Clyde didn't ask, he made his intentions plain. That was early spring. By midsummer, Thomas was gone, laid in the ground with a bullet wound they called an accident. The sheriff didn't ask questions. The town looked away. And I was left with a ranch I could barely hold on to, and a debt that came due faster than grief could settle. I'd been avoiding Main Street ever since, keeping to my chores, minding my own, until the morning Clyde sent word that I had 24 hours to decide, marry him and keep the ranch or lose it all. I tried to leave, made it as far as the county line before his men dragged me back. Now I had the bruises to prove it, though I kept them hidden under my sleeves. That church bell tolled again closer to the hour, and in the stillness after its echo faded, I heard the slow, certain approach of boot heels on wood. Someone had stepped up onto my porch. Clyde Baxter stood at the bottom of my porch steps, his shadow stretching long across the packed dirt, the brim of his hat cutting the sun from his eyes. The bank notice was still in his hand, folded neat, as though paper could soften its meaning. He didn't bother with greetings. Instead, he told me in a flat voice that the debt Thomas had signed for $3,000 was now due in full. 24 hours to pay, or the ranch and everything on it would pass to him. He claimed the paper gave him the right, and the way he smiled said he knew no one in town would contest it. The sheriff's office sat just across the street, its front window glinting in the morning light. But Sheriff Dillard didn't so much as step onto the boardwalk. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching like a man waiting for a chore to finish. Clyde saw my eyes flick his way and followed them. "Don't think the law's gonna help you," he said, tapping the folded paper against his palm. "Best decision you can make is to sign a different kind of contract." Then he told me his terms: marry him and keep the ranch, or lose it all and find myself out on the road before sundown tomorrow. I told him no. He didn't argue, just shifted his weight and looked over at the corral as if measuring how the land would look with his cattle in place of mine. Then he tipped his hat and walked off without another word. That night, I packed a small bundle clothes, the deed, and Thomas's photograph, and saddled the bay mare before dawn. The plan was to ride east, past the county line to my brother's homestead in the next territory. I didn't make it that far. 2 of Clyde's men caught up before I'd covered 10 miles. They were grinning when they rode alongside, blocking the trail. One reached for my reins, the other for the saddlebag where I'd stowed the deed. I fought them, but they had me turn back toward town before noon. By the time we reached my porch again, my wrists were raw under the rope they'd tied. I kept them hidden under my sleeves, after that, the skin darkening to a bruise by morning. The next day, Clyde returned. He didn't mention my failed escape, only reminded me how little time remained. Behind him, his men lounged along the boardwalk, spurs glinting in the sun as though they owned the space they stood on. The townsfolk gave us a wide berth. Women carrying baskets crossed to the far side of the street. Men ducked into doorways. No one met my eyes. The air was still and heavy, the kind that carries sound far. And when Clyde told me the wedding would take place at 3 o'clock sharp, the words seemed to stick in that heat. The morning of the wedding came clear and bright, though it felt colder than any winter day I could remember. I stood on the porch, looking toward the church. The bell would toll before long, calling folks to witness a union they knew was built on threats. The photograph of Thomas lay in my palm, the paper worn soft. I knew I couldn't keep it if Clyde had his way. He wouldn't abide any trace of the life I'd had before. That was when I heard a voice behind me. Mrs. Coleman, deep, unfamiliar. I turned to see a man standing at the foot of the steps. He wore a well-used leather coat, the dust of travel on his boots. His hat was pulled low, but I could see the focus in his dark eyes. Something in his presence shifted the air, though there was nothing in his clothes or gear to set him apart from any other rider passing through. "My name's Sterling Maddox," he said, taking a step closer. "I heard about your situation." My eyes flicked toward the sheriff's office again. Talking to strangers could earn me worse than bruised wrists if Clyde found out. "I don't know what you mean," I told him. He lowered his voice, steady and quiet. "I know what happened to your husband. I know you're being forced into this." Before I could ask how, the church bell began to ring, each toll pulling the hour closer. 2 left before the wedding. Down the street, Clyde appeared, striding toward us with the confidence of a man who believed the day already belonged to him. 3 of his men fell in behind their boots, striking the boardwalk in a rhythm that turned heads. His hand rested on the butt of his gun, but his eyes never left Sterling. "You're talking to my bride," Clyde said, stopping a few paces away. "Move along before you find yourself in trouble you can't handle." Sterling didn't move. He closed the leather pouch he'd been holding and tucked it back inside his coat, his motions unhurried. "Seems to me the lady can speak to whomever she chooses," he replied. The air between them tightened. Clyde's fingers drummed against his holster. "You must be new here. Let me explain how things work. What's mine stays mine, and she's mine." Sterling's voice stayed even. "Is that what you told her husband before you shot him?" The words landed heavy, drawing the eyes of every passerby still on the street. Clyde's men shifted hands, hovering near their weapons. But Clyde held them back with a small gesture. "That's a serious charge," he said, smiling thinly. "You got proof," Sterling met his gaze. "Enough to hang you 3 times over. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk away now or foolish enough to make this worse." The 2 men stood locked in place, the sound of the wind and the creak of a swinging sign filling the gap between them. Then Sterling reached inside his coat again. This time he pulled out a badge. The sun caught the metal, and even from where I stood, I could read the words Deputy U.S. Marshal. "I've been tracking you for 2 months," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the onlookers to hear. Murder, extortion, land theft. The only choice you've got now is whether you come quietly. Clyde let out a short, sharp laugh. You're a long way from any backup, Marshal. Accidents happen to lawmen, same as they happen to ranchers. Sterling smiled, though it held no warmth. You're right. I am a long way from backup. But you're wrong about everything else. He reached into his coat once more and produced a folded telegram. This arrived this morning. The territorial governor has taken an interest in your business. Federal agents will be here by sundown. For the first time, Clyde's face lost color. But the church bell struck again, and his jaw set hard. Then we best finish this wedding before they arrive, he said, his voice low. In a single motion, he stepped forward and seized my arm, pulling me toward the church steps. The iron of his grip bit into my skin. Sterling's hand shifted toward his weapon, but Clyde was quicker, pressing the muzzle of his revolver into my side. The street fell silent, but for the ticking of the windmill at the end of the block. Folks ducked into doorways, closing shutters against what was coming. Clyde began backing toward the church, his men forming a wall around us, their eyes never leaving Sterling. Sterling stayed where he was, his gaze fixed on Clyde. You're making this worse for yourself, he said evenly. Release her now, and maybe the judge shows mercy. Clyde laughed, though the sound had a raw edge. You think I'm afraid of prison? I'd rather die than sit in a cell. The church doors loomed closer, their hinges catching the light. I could feel the hammer of Clyde's revolver shift as he adjusted his grip every step, taking me farther from the open street. Behind us, the bell rope stirred in the breeze, ready to call the hour that would change everything. Clyde's grip on my arm was like a set of iron bands, his revolver pressing into my side with every step he forced me to take. We moved in a slow retreat toward the church, his men forming a living wall that blocked any chance of breaking free. The street beyond them was still doors shut and windows dark, though I could feel the eyes of townsfolk watching from behind glass. Somewhere behind us, the church bell swayed gently in the breeze, each soft creak marking time that felt far too short. Sterling Maddox stood where we'd left him, the sunlight glinting off the badge pinned to his coat. His hand rested on the stock of his rifle, but he didn't lift it yet. Let her go, Baxter, he called, his voice steady enough to carry. You'll only make your case worse. Clyde laughed, though there was no humor in it. You think I'm afraid of the law? If I can't have her, no one can. His gun shifted the barrel, pointing toward the kerosene lamp hung outside the general store. I knew what one shot to that glass would do, flames racing along the boardwalk, swallowing every building in sight. My pulse hammered in my ears. Without thinking, I drove my elbow hard into Clyde's ribs. His breath left him in a sharp grunt, his aim jerking away from the lamp. The gun fired the shot, splintering a post behind us. His grip loosened just enough. I twisted free and stumbled toward the nearest water trough. The crack of Sterling's rifle cut through the stillness like thunder. Clyde's revolver spun from his hand, his cry sharp as the bullet took 2 fingers with it. He clutched the mangled hand against his chest, staggering back. His men reacted fast, drawing their weapons. The street erupted in gunfire, bullets tearing into boards and sending splinters into the air. I crouched behind the trough, the cold water sloshing over my skirt, and caught sight of Sterling moving in measured steps, each shot from his rifle striking true. One man fell with a cry, clutching his leg. Another dropped his pistol as a round tore through his shoulder. Sterling didn't kill them, just made sure they'd never pick up their weapons again. In the space of heartbeats, the fight was nearly over. 3 of Clyde's men lay groaning in the dust, their guns out of reach. I was still crouched low when movement caught my eye. Clyde, pale and bleeding, had pulled a knife from his boot. He came toward me fast, eyes wild. If I go, you go with me, he snarled. I grabbed a loose board from the trough's broken side and swung with both hands. The wood cracked against his temple, the sound deep and final. His body crumpled to the ground, the knife slipping from his fingers. The street went quiet but for the distant rattle of a shutter in the wind. I stood over him, the board still trembling in my hands, my breath coming quick and uneven. Sterling crossed the distance, lowering his rifle as he came. "You hurt?" he asked. I shook my head, feeling the weight of the last hour settle over me. "No," I said, though the pounding in my chest told another story. A few minutes later, riders appeared at the far end of town, the dust of their horses rising into the air. Federal agents, just as Sterling had promised, with a wagon in tow. They dismounted quickly, moving to collect the wounded men and secure Clyde in irons. People began to step from doorways, then faces I'd known for years, relief showing where fear had been. No one went to Clyde. No one spoke his name. I watched as they hauled him toward the wagon, his head lolling, and turned to Sterling. "How long have you known?" I asked. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Since the day it happened." Thomas wasn't his first. I was tracking Clyde for similar crimes in other territories. The words settled heavy in the air between us. Thomas had been one among many, and yet somehow I was the first widow still standing to see justice served. The agents worked with practiced efficiency, gathering up weapons, binding wounds, readying their prisoners for the ride out. The sun was lowering, the heat of the day easing, and the first cool edge of evening wind came down the street. Sterling stood beside me a moment longer, his eyes following the wagon as it rolled away. Then he looked back toward the church, its doors still standing open, the bell rope swaying lightly. "You're free of him now," he said, though his tone held something more, something that didn't quite fit in the open street. I followed his gaze to the church steps, then down to my hands. The photograph of Thomas was still there, the edges damp from the water that had spilled over me. I didn't put it away. From the far end of the street, one of the agents called to Sterling, waving him over. He took a step, then paused, looking at me again. "We'll talk later," he said. Then he turned and walked toward his horse. I watched him mount, watched the agents begin to ride out with their prisoners, and knew the quiet wouldn't last long. Out here, it never did. The wagons rolled away, in a haze of dust, the sound of hooves fading until the street lay quiet again. The only movement came from the last curls of smoke drifting from splintered boards where bullets had struck. I stayed on the church steps, Thomas's photograph held between my hands, the paper soft from years of keeping. The sun had lowered enough to stretch the shadows long across Main Street, casting the whole town in a warm, fading light. Sterling came back from speaking with the agents, his boots sounding solid on the boards. He stopped a few feet from me and removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "There's something you should know," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight under it. "I didn't just come here for Clyde. I knew your husband." The words caught me off guard. I looked up from the photograph, unsure I'd heard him right. "You knew Thomas?" Sterling nodded once. "We served together during the war, saved each other's lives more than once. When he left the service, he told me about a woman named Maggie who'd stolen his heart and about the ranch he meant to build with her." I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. "He never mentioned you." Sterling's gaze stayed steady. Thomas kept certain things close. He'd seen more violence than most men can stomach. "All he wanted was peace with you. But 6 months ago, he wrote to me. Said Clyde was pressing hard for the ranch and making threats. Asked if I knew any federal marshals who took an interest in land fraud." The picture in my mind began to shift. "You were coming to help him." Sterling's jaw tightened. I was 3 days too late. By the time I reached the next town over, Thomas was already gone. That's when I knew Clyde couldn't be allowed to walk free. He looked past me, then to the road where the wagon had disappeared, and back again. I've seen what men like him leave behind. I wasn't going to see it happen here. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air smelled of dust and spent gunpowder, but the sharpness of fear had dulled. The photograph felt heavier than it had that morning. Thomas hadn't just fought for this land, he'd reached out for help when he saw what was coming. Sterling had answered, even if too late to save him. I finally asked, what was he like back then? Sterling's expression softened just a fraction. Brave, stubborn, always trying to take care of everyone else, even when it meant stepping into danger. And he talked about you more than anything. Said you had a laugh that could chase off any darkness and hands steady enough to mend what was broken. The light shifted as the sun dipped lower, the colors deepening to gold and red. I tucked the photograph carefully into my dress pocket and rose from the step. Thank you for telling me. Sterling gave a small nod. Thomas made me promise something in his last letter. If anything happened to him, I was to make sure you knew you could survive anything, that you were stronger than you imagined. The last of the sunlight caught on the windows across the street. A cool breeze carried the faint clatter of a loose sign down by the livery. Sterling settled his hat back on his head and stepped down from the church porch. We'll be leaving soon. The agents want to make the next town before midnight. I followed him with my eyes as he walked toward his horse. What happens to someone like me now? He slowed, turning halfway back. What do you mean? I kept my voice even. A widow with a ranch and no family. Folks like Clyde aren't the only ones who'll try to take what's not theirs. He didn't answer right away. The agents were gathering their reins, the prisoners secured in the wagon. Captain Hayes, a grizzled man with a clipped gray beard, called out to him from the head of the column. Marshal, time to move. Sterling raised a hand in acknowledgement, but stayed where he was. I stepped off the porch, the boards creaking under my boots, and met him halfway. I've spent weeks thinking my life was over, that losing Thomas meant losing everything. But maybe it's just different now. You were his friend. He trusted you. That counts for something. Sterling studied me for a long moment, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Maggie, you've been through enough today to fill a lifetime. Don't make choices on relief alone. I shook my head. It's not that. I've seen what you do, and I know why you do it. That's the kind of man Thomas would have wanted beside me, one who stands when others step aside. The wind picked up just enough to stir the dust along the street. Hayes called again, this time with more urgency. Sterling glanced toward him, then back to me. Whatever he meant to say next was cut off by the sound of hooves on the hard-packed road. I turned to see a line of riders emerging from the far end of town, their shapes dark against the last of the sun. They weren't the agents. Their pace was fast, their shoulders squared, and I recognized the set of their hats and the weight of their gun belts. Clyde's men, those who hadn't been in town earlier, were riding in hard. The riders closed the distance fast, the low thunder of hooves drumming through the packed earth. Their silhouettes sharpened in the fading light, five men in trail-stained coats, gun belts slung low, faces shadowed under wide brims. They reined up hard at the edge of town dust, curling around the legs of their horses. The lead man's voice cut across the still air. You killed our boss. Nobody walks away from that. Captain Hayes barked orders to his agents, their focus split between holding the prisoners and guarding the street. Sterling stepped forward without hesitation, his rifle loose but ready in his hands. Maggie, he said without turning, get inside the church. I didn't move. My eyes had gone to the porch of my house, where Thomas's hunting rifle leaned against the wall. My boots carried me there without thinking. I broke the breech, checked the chamber, and stepped back into the street. This is my town now, I said, the weight of the rifle steady in my hands. I'm not hiding. The first shot cracked from the far end, a warning meant to rattle us. Sterling answered with a clean, sharp report from his own rifle, the lead rider's hat spinning into the dirt. The others spurred forward, fanning out to press from both sides. The agents spread, using the wagon as cover while keeping their captives from bolting. Then something shifted. From the smithy, Eli Carter emerged, a shotgun balanced in his arms, his apron still on. The banker, Mr. Lang, stepped from his doorway with an old but serviceable rifle. Even Reverend Howe came down the church steps with a cavalry saber drawn from some long-forgotten trunk. The street lit with muzzle flashes as the fight broke in earnest. My shoulder pressed into the corner post of the Mercantile as I took aim. The first shot dropped a rider from his saddle, his leg twisted under him in the dust. Sterling moved through the chaos like he'd been born to it. Each pull of the trigger, deliberate, each shot finding its mark. Another of Clyde's men wheeled his horse toward the livery, maybe to flank us. But Lang's rifle barked once, sending him tumbling into the street. Eli fired both barrels into the dirt in front of two more, their mounts rearing in panic. The air was thick with gunpowder and shouts, the acrid smoke blurring the shapes ahead of me. One rider broke through the line, his revolver raised. I swung the rifle, the sight settling on his chest. The report was deafening at that range, and he went backward out of the saddle, his pistol clattering across the boards. Behind me, Reverend Howe planted himself in the street, saber raised, daring anyone else to come close. The fight didn't last long. Outnumbered and pressed from both sides, the riders began to falter. Two threw down their guns and raised their hands. The others spurred hard for the open country, the pounding of their retreat fading toward the horizon. Hayes sent 2 agents after them, but kept the rest in town to secure the surrendering men. Silence came slow, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the hiss of cooling gun barrels. I lowered the rifle, my hand steady despite the heat in my chest. Sterling crossed the street toward me, his eyes sweeping the ground for any sign of lingering threat. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm done running." Around us, folks began to gather, their voices low but certain. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Even with the smoke hanging in it, it carried the start of something new. Hayes looked from the townspeople to Sterling. "Doesn't look like they need federal protection much longer," he said, half smiling. Sterling's answer was quiet, but his gaze stayed on me. Maybe they still do. The agents set about loading the new prisoners into the wagon, the chains clinking in the dusk. Sterling leaned on his rifle a moment longer, then glanced toward me. "You asked me earlier what happens to someone like you. Maybe the answer's simpler than we thought." I met his eyes. "And what's that?" He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "You keep the ranch. I stay here. We both make sure no one like Clyde ever sets foot in this town again." The last light bled from the horizon, the lanterns along Main Street flickering to life one by one. I held his gaze, the sounds of the town settling back into place, boots on boards, a door closing, somewhere the soft low of cattle in the distance. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel like an empty road. Hayes and his men worked into the evening, chaining the new prisoners alongside Clyde's earlier crew. The town was quieter now, though. Every so often the wind carried a hammer strike from the smithy or the muted thud of a door closing. Lanterns began to glow along the boardwalk, their light pushing back the darkness in small, steady pools. Sterling stood with Hayes at the head of the wagon, speaking low. From where I watched, their words didn't carry. But Sterling's glance toward me was deliberate before he stepped away from the captain. He crossed the street, boots sounding on the boards, and stopped just short of where I stood. "The banknote's gone," he said without preamble. "I had it nullified before I came here. Legal and binding. The ranch is yours free and clear." The news landed like a weight set down after too many miles. Clyde's holdings will be sold off to cover debts. What's left will go toward the damage he caused. His voice was steady, but there was something else behind it, a finality maybe, or the knowledge of a promise kept? I asked, and the others? The ones who weren't here today? Sterling's eyes narrowed a fraction. We'll find them. Men like that don't stay hidden for long. Hayes has the reach to bring them in. The captain, hearing his name, tipped his hat from across the way before climbing up onto the wagon bench. The agents began checking straps and lanterns for the road ahead. The street had taken on that particular stillness that comes after a storm board swept clean by hurried brooms, glass gathered into piles, the dust settling. Folks stood in small knots speaking low, the relief plain on their faces even in the dim light. Reverend Howe was back on the church steps, leaning on his saber like a walking stick, watching the wagons prepare to move. Sterling looked around, then back at me. I meant what I said earlier. If you want someone to help you keep this place safe, I'm willing. I can set up a permanent post here. This territory could use a federal presence. My fingers tightened slightly around the stock of Thomas's rifle still in my hands. You think the town would want that? He glanced toward the clusters of people watching us. I think they already decided. The last of the prisoners were loaded chains clinking as they shifted inside the wagon. Hayes swung down from the bench and came over. We'll take these men east and turn them over in Yates Crossing. Paperwork says you're to file your claim with the circuit judge when he passes through next month. Maddox can guide you through it. He shook Sterling's hand, then mine, and went back to his men. As the wagons rolled out, the sound of wheels and hooves fading toward the open country, I realized how different the street felt underfoot. The air was cooler now, the night carrying scents of dust lamp oil and the faint smoke from a cook stove somewhere. Sterling stayed beside me, watching until the lantern glow disappeared down the road. We stood in that quiet until a pair of townsfolk approached Eli Carter with his sleeves still rolled and Mr. Lang with his hat in hand. They thanked us in simple words, nothing drawn out, and promised to see the town stayed ready should trouble ride in again. When they moved off, Sterling said, "That's the thing about places like this. Folks will stand if they've got someone to stand with." I thought about the weeks before today when every door had been closed to me, when no one would meet my eyes in the street. Seems they've got that now, I said. His gaze lingered on me a moment before shifting toward the north end of town, where the dark met the road. Still, he said, best not to let our guard down. A gust came through, then cool against my face, bringing with it the faint distant rhythm of a single horse on the road. I turned toward the sound, watching a small shape approach from beyond the edge of town. Sterling caught it too, his posture changing slightly as he rested a hand near the butt of his revolver. The single rider slowed as he reached the edge of the lantern light, dust settling around his horse's legs. He was young, maybe 20 at most, with a thin frame under a worn trail coat and eyes that flicked quickly from me to Sterling. His hat brim shadowed most of his face, but I caught the nervous shift in his jaw when he saw the rifle in my hands. Sterling stepped forward first. "Evening," he said, keeping his voice even. "You here for something, or just passing through?" The rider's gaze darted toward the north road before coming back. "Name's Jesse Holt," he said finally. "I worked for Baxter, till about a week ago." The name didn't mean much to me, but Sterling's stance changed slightly. "If you're looking to collect a debt, you're too late," he said. Jesse shook his head quickly. "Not here for that. I've been riding hard since I heard what happened in town. Figured you ought to know Baxter had more friends than the ones you've taken in." He swung down from the saddle, the horse shifting under the sudden weight change. "They're not all in this county. Word's gone out about what you did. Some will come for money, some for blood." The way he said it, quiet but sure, left no doubt he believed it. Sterling glanced at me before asking, "How many?" Jesse shrugged, looking down at his hands. "Can't say. A dozen, maybe more. They're scattered rail camps, mining outfits, but they'll hear and they'll ride." The lantern light caught the dust on his coat as he shifted from foot to foot. "Thought I should warn you before I moved on." I asked him why he didn't stay with them. He hesitated, then said, "I hired on to work cattle, not to shake down widows. After what they did to your husband, I wasn't going to stand with that." His words hung there for a moment, heavier than the quiet around us. Sterling nodded once. "All right. You've done your part. Best keep moving if you don't want to be here when they come." Jesse looked at me, then tipping his hat slightly. "Ma'am." He mounted in one smooth motion and turned his horse toward the dark, the sound of hoofbeats fading until there was only the whisper of the wind again. Sterling let out a slow breath. He's telling the truth. I didn't doubt it. The street felt different now. Not the relieved stillness after a fight, but the watchful pause before the next trouble rolled in. "Then we'd best be ready," I said. We walked back toward my porch, the boards cool underfoot in the night air. The rifle stayed in my hands, not out of fear, but because I wasn't willing to set it aside yet. Sterling stopped at the bottom step. "If you're sure about me staying, I'll send word to Hayes. He can route correspondence and supplies here through the circuit riders. It'd make this place an official post." I thought of the ranch fences to mend cattle to tend, and the town with its merchants and families who'd stood their ground earlier that day. "If it keeps them safe, I'm sure." He gave a short nod, and for the first time that day, his shoulders eased a fraction. A few townsfolk still lingered by the lamplight, speaking in low voices. Eli Carter caught my eye and raised a hand in a brief wave before heading toward the smithy. The rest drifted off in twos and threes, doors closing behind them until Main Street was quiet again. Sterling tipped his hat. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start putting things in order. Trouble will find us soon enough." I nodded my hand on the porch rail. "Then we'll be ready." He turned toward the boarding house, his boots fading into the distance as I stepped inside, the door closing softly behind me. In the stillness of my front room, I set the rifle by the door and lit a lamp, its warm glow catching the frame of Thomas's photograph where it sat on the table. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of a horse somewhere far off, reminding me that Jesse Holt's warning was already in motion. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I left the lamp burning low, its glow catching on the frame of Thomas's photograph and the polished wood of the rifle leaning by the door. The air outside was still, though. Every now and then, I caught the faint creak of the sign over the mercantile or the distant bark of a dog. Somewhere past the horizon, riders might already be gathering, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone in waiting. At first light, Sterling was on my porch, with 2 cups of coffee steam curling into the cool air. We sat without talking, watching Main Street come alive, Eli Carter sweeping the smithy steps, Mrs. Lang opening the shutters on the mercantile, Reverend Howe crossing the street with his Bible tucked under his arm. The quiet bustle felt different now, as if the town had shaken off a weight it didn't realize it was carrying. Later that week, Hayes sent word through the telegraph office. The prisoners were delivered without trouble, the circuit judge set to arrive before month's end, and our claims against Clyde's estate already in motion. Sterling read the message once, folded it neatly, and slid it into his coat. "That's the last of it," he said. "The rest is ours to build." Work filled the days that followed, mending fences, checking the herd, shoring up the porch where the boards had started to sag. Sterling split his time between the ranch and town, setting up a small desk in the old freight office for his federal work. Folks began stopping by not with complaints, but with news questions, and sometimes just to share a coffee by the stove. The change was slow, but it was steady. One evening, I stood at the pasture fence, the sky streaked with the last red light of day. Sterling joined me, leaning on the top rail. "Place looks different," he said. I glanced at the barn, the house, the neat line of cattle along the far field. "Feels different too," I told him. We stayed there until the first stars came out, not needing to say more. By the time the circuit judge arrived, the town was ready. Testimony was given, deeds signed, and by sundown the ranch was legally mine. When the judge asked if I wanted to sell any portion, I shook my head. "Some things aren't meant to be bargained for," I said. And he nodded like he understood. 6 months later, Sterling and I stood in that same church where the worst day of my life had nearly begun. This time the pews were full for a different reason. I walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers from the meadow. Outside, the bells rang clear and bright, carrying across the open country. Looking back now, I know justice isn't always a matter of courtrooms or badges. Sometimes it's neighbors stepping forward when they've been silent too long. Sometimes it's finding the courage to stand when you've been forced to your knees. And sometimes it's knowing when to build a life with the people who choose to stand beside you. If you've ever found your own strength in a place you thought was lost, you'll understand why I stayed here and why I'll keep this land safe for as long as I can. I'd like to hear your thoughts, share your story if you're willing. And we'll keep these conversations alive for those who come after.